This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the world. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/eyebrowcinema. Newsflash! Someone made a YouTube video that I don't like very much. Is essentially the crux of today's essay. The video in question is The Wendy Theory, where creator Rob Navarro argues that Wendy Torrance is the true villain of The Shining, that she is the abusive parent tormenting Danny, and the scenes of Jack as abuser, or the supernatural presence of the Overlook Hotel, are in fact just Wendy's hallucinations. Proof for this theory is found in the litany of continuity errors, which Navarro believes suggests the reality presented by the film is unstable, and other visual details, which suggest the surface narrative is merely an illusion.
Yes, it's Wendy that has the psychological issues. Her hallucinations have now fully convinced her that Jack is the one that hurt Danny, and that Jack is unstable and dangerous. If you haven't already guessed, if Wendy is in 237, then she is the one that hurts Danny's neck. But if his shoulder was actually dislocated, we now know that it was most likely Wendy that injured Danny and made up the story of Jack doing it to gain the attention, but not the blame.
I think this theory is very bad, built on flimsy evidence to support a misguided conclusion that wildly misinterprets the film. But why make an essay in response? Dozens of bad videos from Film YouTube are published every day, and The Shining in particular is a magnet for half-baked conspiratorial thinking. Why get so worked up over this one video? Well, for one, the Wendy theory has proven quite popular. At the time of writing, the video currently has around 830,000 views, suggesting its ideas have had some influence, and I think that's worth pushing back on. On a deeper level though, debunking the Wendy theory also provides a platform to discuss film interpretation as a process, specifically what we assign meaning to in movies and how those meanings are decoded. More than debunking a bad film theory, it's the process of interpretation that I really want to address here. To that end, I want to stress that I don't intend this video to be a personal attack on Rob Navarro or reflective of a YouTuber beef. As my role model once said, it's not personal, it's strictly business. With that in mind, let's get into the weeds. The Cliff Notes summary of The Shining's plot is as follows. Down on his luck writer and recovering alcoholic Jack Torrance has been hired as the caretaker for the Overlook Hotel for the winter, where he and his family will be the only inhabitants during the off-season. Jack had physically abused his son Danny in the past, and that violence comes to the fore again, as a combination of extreme isolation and the supernatural forces of the Overlook Hotel drive Jack to madness, and he attempts to murder his wife and son. The basic premise of the Wendy theory is that Jack's wife Wendy is the true abuser. She is the abusive parent who has hurt Danny, and she's also mentally ill, possibly schizophrenic. Every scene of Jack's abuses or the supernatural are actually Wendy hallucinations. The bulk of Navarro's evidence to support this theory is found in the film's many continuity errors, specifically pieces of furniture disappearing and other inconsistencies within the geography. Kubrick, ever the perfectionist, would not allow continuity errors after all. The interview scene and move-in day sequence establish both the setting of the Overlook and the film's reality. Whenever Kubrick subsequently breaks that setting's geography, it also signifies a break in reality, and that we're seeing one of Wendy's hallucinations. To cite some of Navarro's examples of broken continuity, the chair behind Jack as he angrily shouts at Wendy for interrupting him disappears between shots. The nightstand between the bed and the bathroom in the Torrance's room is missing when Danny asks Jack if he'd ever hurt him or his mom. The storeroom doesn't have the light switch when Dick and Danny discuss The Shining, or when Wendy drags Jack into the storeroom. Kool-Aid cans suddenly appear when Dick first demonstrates his shining powers, that were not in the previous shot. The Gold Room sign is different when Jack heads to the bar than how it appeared earlier. The colors of Danny's tricycle when he rides around the hotel are different than what appears on move-in day. And the red couch previously shown in the front hallway is missing in the final shot. Therefore, according to Navarro, all of these scenes are hallucinations. And notice too, these are the scenes that most prominently indicate Jack's abuses, the Overlook's ghosts, and supernatural powers. Navarro further notes the stacks of books in the Torrance home as clues to Wendy's vivid imagination when constructing her hallucinations, and to her reading The Catcher in the Rye specifically as a sign of her violent tendencies, given the novel's real-life association with murderers. The dissolve from the inside of room 237 to Wendy is also a clue that Wendy is in fact the crazy woman in 237. At the end of the scene where Jack yells at Wendy for interrupting his writing, which remember is a hallucination, Navarro observes Jack's final expression as the look of a man who has witnessed something disturbing, which Navarro believes to be the unstable behavior of Wendy during her hallucinations. As noted earlier, the absence of the light switch outside the storeroom is, according to the theory, proof that the scene where Wendy drags Jack into the storeroom is a hallucination. Navarro instead argues that Wendy actually drags Jack into the hedge maze to freeze to death, as evidenced by the final reveal of a frozen Jack, where he is covered by more snow than would have fallen in just one night, suggesting he has in fact been out there much longer. If Dick and Danny don't actually have shining powers, then how is Dick summoned to the Overlook, you might ask? Well, Navarro argues that Dick's line about the caretakers being completely unreliable assholes is in fact legitimate, that Ullman did call Dick in to replace the Torrances. Okay, but who called Ullman? Why, Jack himself, in the scene where Jack enters the office and dismantles the radio. We see Ullman's nameplate on the desk, which is consistent with the interview scene and indicates Jack really did enter the office. But at the same time, there is a light switch leading into the room that wasn't there before, indicating there are also elements of hallucination at play in the scene. Therefore, Navarro concludes that Jack did enter the room but did not dismantle the radio, and instead called Ullman for help in response to Wendy's increasingly erratic behavior. How does Wendy construct hallucinations about the Grady murders if she does not know about them? Navarro believes that Jack does in fact tell her about Grady, even if we don't see it, as evidenced by Jack proclaiming Wendy a horror enthusiast in his job interview. Surely then, he would tell his wife about the murders, if she is a fan of ghoulish tales like he says she is. Navarro finally concludes that he believes this to be the most plausible interpretation of The Shining, as it does not involve the supernatural in any capacity. This is not an exhaustive summary of Navarro's video, but it does capture the essence and major arguments of the Wendy theory. And with all that established, let's talk about why it's all rubbish. Much of the Wendy theory is predicated on the many continuity errors in The Shining, and the belief that a perfectionist like Kubrick would never allow for so many mistakes.
These things that have been previously identified as errors must have been done on purpose. Stanley Kubrick would not have allowed continuity errors.
This premise is demonstrably false. Here is a small sample of just some of the continuity errors throughout Stanley Kubrick's filmography. Hartman punches Joker with his left hand, but in the next shot has used his right. Mandrake protects himself from gunfire with a chair, which disappears in the next shot. 2 rubber bands on Bill's desk disappear between shots. Pyle is sleeping on 2 pillows at the start of the blanket party, but only one is shown in the next angle. Barry bloodies Toole's face boxing, but the blood disappears as the fight continues. Charlotte's cigarette disappears between shots. George's hat is missing in one shot, but is back on in the next. The color order of Dave's food changes between shots. Spartacus and Antonius are clean-shaven, despite having supposedly walked for days on end. Pyle sits down on the 4th toilet from the end, but is on the 3rd toilet in the next angle. Alex's last name is DeLarge, but the newspaper refers to him as Alex Burgess. The shadow cast by the B-52 bomber is actually that of a World War II-era B-17. Blood splatters on the sniper's face, which disappears in her close-up. Lolita grabs a plate with her left hand, but holds it in her right in the next shot. Now, are we to believe every one of these errors is indicative of yet another Wendy hallucination? Or Are continuity errors simply a normal part of filmmaking that appear all over Kubrick's work? Probably the latter. How can there be so many mistakes on a major motion picture, you may ask? Well, I have two answers, one philosophical, the other functional. For philosophy, let's turn to surrealist painter René Magritte and his 1929 painting, The Treachery of Images. We have a drawing of a pipe, and just beneath it, text which reads, "This is not a pipe." The point in this supposed contradiction is that the object depicted in an image is never actually that object, but a representation, a sign which signifies to the viewer the real thing. This is not a pipe, but a representation of a pipe. We might look at it and instinctively think, oh, that's a pipe, but if we tried to stuff and smoke it, we'd quickly realize its limitations. That is the treachery of images, and the cinematic image is the most treacherous of all. Photography captures physical detail so vividly and with such lifelike accuracy that it doesn't seem to represent reality so much as capture it outright. Linear continuity editing, particularly on a shot-to-shot basis, seeks to depict the flow of time the same way we experience it. In both the fidelity of photographic images and the way editing links those images together, they feel real. But this is an illusion. Lighting and lenses are used to shape and distort the physical qualities of an actor, who are themselves costumed and choreographed to appear in very specific ways. A scene may be edited to appear to play out in real time, but is actually constructed from several takes, filmed at different times from different angles, at sometimes in different locations altogether. What does all this have to do with the continuity errors in The Shining? Well, in the same way that this is not a pipe, this is not a hotel. The Overlook is a composite of several sources: exterior shots of the Timberline Lodge in Oregon, miniatures and models, and film sets built in Elstree Studios in London, all depicted by a camera and reorganized in editing to create the illusion of a cohesive space. But it's just a representation. If you expect the Overlook to adhere to the rules of a real hotel, you'll quickly realize its limitations. Furniture will disappear, and physical details will change without pattern or reason, sometimes within the space of the same scene. Because for as much as everything on screen might feel real on a subconscious level, it merely seeks to represent the real rather than reproduce it. This is not a pipe. On a more functional level, making movies is really goddamn hard. Kubrick himself described directing as, quote, like trying to write War and Peace in a bumper car in an amusement park. And The Shining was a particularly chaotic production, an arduous shoot wherein principal photography lasted for over a year, and the script was rewritten constantly. At one point during production, a fire at Elstree badly damaged the sets and they had to be rebuilt. In the middle of this kind of production, it's inevitable that continuity will not be 100% consistent. But Kubrick was a perfectionist, you might say. And yeah, he was, but I think this aspect of his personality is often misinterpreted. Kubrick's perfectionism was more concerned with things like composition, lighting, movement, performance, and the overall affect of an image, not whether Ullman's nameplate is in the same spot that it was 8 scenes ago. All this to say, the belief that The Shining's continuity errors are a secret Morse code from Kubrick indicative of the hidden real story is simply not true. Of course, just because an aspect of a film was not intended by the director does not mean an audience can't derive meaning from it. Even if we assume every continuity error was an unintended mistake, they're still in the movie, and therefore are fair game for interpretation. Indeed, the continuity errors and inconsistent geography of The Shining have yielded compelling analysis in the past. One frequent interpretation argues that the disappearing furniture and other lapses in the physical makeup of the Overlook are essentially a more subtle manifestation of a classic haunted house trope. wherein objects move with a will of their own, as if pushed by an invisible force. In this reading, the moving furniture is an expression of the Overlook's supernatural power. So why is this interpretation okay by me, but the Wendy theory is objectionable? Well, for one, this interpretation is consistent with the film overall. We might not see a chair get telepathically thrown across a room, but we do get ghosts and spooky skeletons and telepathic visions of horror, and a soundtrack which seems to evoke a primal evil. Interpreting the moving furniture as a further expression of the Overlook's ghostly powers enhances the supernatural presence which already exists in The Shining, while the Wendy theory imposes a meaning onto the text which runs counter to what the film is actually doing. The other big difference in these interpretations is one of specificity. Reading the moving furniture as a further expression of supernatural horror is ultimately an interpretation rooted in the film's mood and atmosphere, how it feels to watch The Shining. The Wendy theory, on the other hand, is based on a stricter literalism. The moving furniture indicates we're now watching a Wendy hallucination because Wendy is actually mentally ill and has constructed a fictional narrative in her head which disguises her own abuses. The problem is this sort of specificity demands greater evidence to prove, evidence which Navarro does not provide. Why are we to believe Wendy is mentally ill? According to the Wendy theory, Wendy hallucinates because she's mentally ill, and we know she's mentally ill because she hallucinates. It's circular reasoning. The only other indicator of Wendy's mental illness Navarro provides is that we see Wendy reading The Catcher in the Rye, a novel which has been linked to real-life murderers suffering from mental illness. Except this also falls apart when you realize that the first case of a mentally ill person committing murder supposedly under the influence of The Catcher in the Rye was Mark David Chapman's murder of John Lennon in December of 1980, 6 months after The Shining was released in theaters. At best, the book's presence in The Shining is an eerie coincidence, and frankly, even that's a stretch. It's only eerie if you already believe Wendy is psychotic. And again, we're back to that circular reasoning. If we don't have adequate proof of Wendy being mentally ill, then why should we assume the hallucinations Navarro identifies are actually Wendy's? Why not Jack's or Danny's? The only time Navarro highlights an element of the film which defines a hallucination as being Wendy's specifically is in the storeroom, where he claims the Kool-Aid cans, which are indicative of the scene being a hallucination in the first place, are stored in the same place Wendy stores her Kool-Aid cans at home. But they're not. Wendy keeps her Kool-Aid on top of the fridge, not in a storeroom or in a pantry. The two shots Navarro uses to make this point aren't even similar in their composition. If the idea is that Wendy is projecting her own kitchen into the Overlooks, then why isn't the placement of the Kool-Aid in the frame consistent across both shots? The only real similarity is that both shots have cans of Kool-Aid in them, which is not sufficient evidence that this is Wendy's hallucination. A lot of the Wendy theory's evidence falls apart under this kind of scrutiny. Navarro claims the missing end table and chair in the scene are indicative of a Wendy hallucination, but we also see those items in later shots where Jack berates Wendy. If the items missing is what marks a hallucination, wouldn't that mean this shot is still real? Similarly, Navarro believes that the bedside table between the bedroom and the bathroom missing in this scene indicates a hallucination. Okay, but then he also argues that Jack's break-in with the axe is a hallucination too, but we see the bedside table in its proper spot here. By Navarro's logic, wouldn't that make this scene real? And by extension, wouldn't that blow a huge hole in the foundations of the Wendy theory? Navarro also misreads a lot of the film's imagery and dialogue at a more basic level. He claims near the start of his video that this shot was the key for unlocking the Wendy theory, because Jack doesn't have the look of a man who
just told his wife to get the F out.
And I just think that he's wrong here. To me, this absolutely looks like a man angry he just had to deal with an annoyance, and is trying to put it behind him. And there are several moments like this throughout the movie.
It's just a matter of settling back into the habit of writing every day.
Yeah, that's all it is.
Navarro claims that this shot of Jack frozen in the maze is indicative that Wendy dragged his body out earlier, as he is covered in more snow than would have fallen in a single night. Except the film never says this shot is the morning after we saw Jack slump down in the snow. It might have been one day, or several days, or even weeks since. Navarro argues that Danny calls her his mom when the ball rolls to him in the hall because he knows she's there with him, supporting the belief that Wendy is the woman who strangles Danny in room 237. But the movie also makes a point to show that Wendy is the only person who ever plays with Danny. He calls for his mom then because of the two people in the hotel, Wendy is far more likely to want to play with him than Jack. Navarro argues that the dissolve from the inside of room 237 to a shot of Wendy is a clue that Wendy is the crazy woman in room 237. Admittedly, I actually think this is one of the more persuasive points the Wendy theory makes, given it is at least directly tied to cinematic language, but I still don't buy its conclusion. One of the things that a dissolve does is stretch the time which passes between images, suggesting a lot of time has passed between shot A and shot B. This is in fact a technique used throughout The Shining, and in this specific case, it's also a source of suspense, given we slowly leave Danny as he enters into territory firmly established as dangerous.
Stay out.
So while Navarro's read here is genuinely compelling, it isn't particularly convincing. The key misread for me, though, is Navarro's argument that Jack must have told Wendy about the Grady murders, providing the creative fuel for her hallucinations and fantasies, because Jack mentions in the interview that his wife is a ghost story and horror film addict. Clearly, then, Jack would tell Wendy about the macabre history of the Overlook. What Navarro misses is that Jack is lying. He isn't saying his wife loves horror because it's true, he's saying it because he really needs the job, and wants to reassure Ullman the Overlook's violent past won't be an issue for Jack or his family. Nothing about the woman we meet in the film suggests she a horror fan. She is visibly uncomfortable when conversations turn to ghoulish subjects like cannibalism, and the books and movies she shows interest in are coming-of-age stories, not horror. Navarro takes Jack's word here because he can use that to support his own narrative, and that core underpins the whole of the Wendy theory. Evidence is selectively cherry-picked when it can support the main argument, and dropped or ignored when they contradict it. To that end, it's beneficial that the theory is predicated on some scenes being hallucinations, as it allows Navarro to dismiss scenes which refute his theory and make up scenes that support it. Jack all but looks down the lens and explains, "I am an abusive father who physically attacked my son." Well, that's a hallucination. You can't take that at face value. At no point does the movie show Ullman call on Dick to replace the Torrances or Jack tell Wendy about the Grady murders. Well, those did happen, we just didn't see them. It's all very convenient.
And that also is very convenient, isn't it, Mr.
Navarro.
Well, there's one other thing I think we should talk about.
In his conclusion, Navarro states that the Wendy theory is the most plausible interpretation of The Shining because it doesn't involve the supernatural.
I think this theory is more plausible than any other theory out there. It doesn't involve the supernatural, or rely upon Jack as the one that goes crazy, which some of those theories still often involve the supernatural.
This is very silly. The Shining is a work of fiction. The creators can imagine any fantastical situation they want without having to worry about whether it would happen in real life, because it's make-believe. Is an interpretation of Spider-Man where Peter dies from radiation poisoning and the subsequent trilogy is actually a deathbed hallucination more plausible because it doesn't involve superpowers? Analyzing a fictional story with the same lens you would real-life events is inherently faulty. This is not a pipe after all. What's more, the Wendy theory misinterprets The Shining so substantially that it both misses the point of the story and makes for just a worse movie. Navarro's video presents his theory as if it's some deep, hidden secret, but for all the theory's intricacy and detail, it's essentially just a more elaborate version of "it was all a dream." If you accept the Wendy theory as being true, you're left with a movie where almost nothing actually happens because it's mostly just hallucinations, and where the key scenes of drama and tension are not actually shown. Much as the video starts with this alluring promise of this tantalizing secret found in The Shining, what it actually does is makes the movie less exciting. And on a deeper level, the Wendy theory is so thoroughly focused on tiny details that it misses the obvious, twisting into a pretzel to refute the overwhelming depiction of Jack as abuser to instead see Wendy as the villain. I've sort of danced around this point all video, but much of the language Navarro uses mirrors the language used to defend abusers and discredit survivors.
This could have all been a made-up story by Wendy, to gain sympathy or attention. Yes, it's Wendy that has the psychological issues. She could be schizophrenic. If Wendy is in 237, then she is the one that hurts Danny's neck. You heard it right, she is the crazy woman in 237.
My point here is not to suggest that the video condones domestic abuse, but to demonstrate the folly of viewing movies as puzzle boxes. In trying to solve The Shining, the resulting theory is antithetical to what the film is actually doing. So much of The Shining is devoted to highlighting the abuse Wendy is subjected to, not just the physical terror of Jack trying to murder her and Danny with an axe, but also the ways Jack belittles and dismisses Wendy, mocking her fears and describing her with open contempt. Kubrick also observes the lingering psychological damage, in how Wendy has rationalized Jack's abuse of her son as an innocent mistake, or how she needs to psych herself up just to confront her husband when she disagrees with him. Much of the horror of The Shining comes in how thoroughly the film depicts an abusive relationship. But under the Wendy theory, a movie about the horror of abuse and the violence a woman suffers at the hands of her husband is interpreted as a story of a crazy woman who projects her own hysteria onto an innocent man.
How does Jack look now? Does this mean Jack is just a loving husband, trying to live a life with a woman with psychological issues? It's looking like it, doesn't it?
This isn't a case of merely interpreting a work differently than the author intended. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the text, closer to fan fiction and how it reimagines the characters and plot. And it's that severity of misunderstanding that makes the Wendy theory worth discussing. It is the logical endpoint of trying to solve a movie without actually engaging with its ideas, so misguided that its conclusions replicate the very attitudes that the film itself deems as monstrous. Thank you to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service where you can watch some of the most beautiful and incredible works of cinema from around the world. Every day, Mubi premieres a new film. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, there's always something new to discover. And these movies don't come from a faceless algorithm, but are handpicked by actual human beings. It's like your own personal film festival, streaming anytime, anywhere. With October here, it's time for spooky viewing, and Mubi has a whole collection of horror, ranging from obscure gems to modern classics. I want to especially highlight Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse. Like The Shining, the film is a ghost story that delivers supernatural thrills and atmosphere to spare, but is also a moody story of trauma and violence, begging for interpretation. And the best part, you can watch it and a whole host of amazing cinema for free right now. Just head to mubi.com/eyebrowcinema for a free 30 days. That's a whole month of great cinema for free.